Resuming debate, the honourable member for Markham-Unionville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased today to rise today to join in the chorus of condemnation of the Conservative government's attempt to hide a $330 million tax hike. It is a little bit weird, however, that we have the NDP, which is traditionally protectionist, pushing for lower tariffs, and we have the Conservatives, who are traditionally non-protectionist, pushing for higher tariffs. We Liberals are the only consistent ones, because we traditionally push for lower tariffs, which is what, in fact, we are doing today. Parce que d'habitude, si on...
Because normally, if we meet someone and ask the question, do you think that these tariff obstacles are a good thing? If the person says yes, it might be a member of the NDP speaking. If the person says no, it's probably a Conservative or a Liberal.
Itself in a situation of some confusion relative to its normal state of mind, but nevertheless we agree with them fully on this motion. The decision by this Conservative government represents a massive broken promises and will have negative implications for middle-class Canadian families, Canadian retailers, and even some of the world's poorest countries. I was surprised to read about these tariff increases in Budget 2013, as I clearly remember reading in the Conservative 2011 platform, in bold text no less, that they would, and I quote, not raise taxes on Canadian consumers, end of quote. So that's exactly what they have done here, Mr. Speaker, a massive $330 million tax on consumers. Now, with all due respect to the sanctity of this House, I would make the general proposition that from a normal or intellectual point of view, this debate is totally ridiculous. Because everybody knows, as stated by our new Liberal leader in question period, the dictionary definition of a tariff is a tax on imports. Everybody knows that they've raised tariffs by $330 million. So they've raised taxes. That's clear. That's logical. I don't see any argument against it. If a tariff is a tax on imports, if imports go up $330 million, that's a tax hike. Now, it's true they cut some tariffs, but by a much smaller amount. So net tariff revenue has gone up, ergo a tax increase. And this ridiculous argument that if it's the tariffs on China and India that go up, then it's not a tariff increase, that's stupid. A tariff is a tariff. The market doesn't care whether it's a justified tariff or an unjustified tariff. If the tariff goes up, the cost of the good and the price of the good goes up, and it's a tax. So it doesn't matter whether they will argue that China and India no longer deserve these low tariffs. It still is the case that if those tariffs go up, prices go up, and that is a tax hike. Oh, and Mr. Speaker, I hope you won't mind if I mention a little bit late that I'd like to share half of my time with the member from Winnipeg North. So that's the first case. This tariff hike is a tax hike. Any normal person would agree with that. A second example is these EI premium tax hikes that they keep doing. They've had 3 increases in EI, coming to nearly $2 billion per year. Is that not a tax hike? And if it is, how dare they say in the budget that they won't have any tax hikes? It is a tax hike. An employment insurance premium is a tax on jobs, a direct tax on jobs. So any increase in EI premiums is a tax hike, not just any old tax, but a tax on jobs to the tune of close to $2 billion a year. So that's a second case where they were wrong. Now, I suppose they could muddle around and say, well, the word tax isn't there, employment insurance premium, so we won't call it a tax hike. But that's just fiddling with words. EI premium is a tax. It's a tax on jobs, and it has to be counted as such. But if they can pretend that a tariff increase is not a tax hike, or an EI premium increase is not a tax hike, they certainly cannot pretend that an increase in the income tax rate is not a tax hike. And that's what they did in 2006. They increased the income tax rate by a half a percentage point. This was published in CRA. It was a done deal, and they tried to claim they were lowering the tax rate by a half a point. So ce que j'essaie de dire en...
What I'm trying to say in English, Mr. Speaker, is that at least 3 times the Conservatives have increased taxes, whether it is on income tax, whether it is in EI premiums, or through tariffs. And each and every time they denied what was very obvious, which is that in every case they did in fact increase taxes.
Play this game, which from an intellectual point of view appears to be ridiculous and evidently wrong? I think the only reason is when you add the political element. They think they can get away with it. We all know what they're saying is wrong, but if they can say repeatedly again and again and again and again that they're not raising taxes, even though self-evidently they are, they're hoping that the public won't notice and that they can carry this message, even though it's untruthful, through to the public. So that's why we have motions like this today, to try to get the information out to the public that they are doing, in fact, what we all know they are doing, which is raising taxes. And so that is why, among other reasons, the Liberal Party is pleased to support this NDP motion in an attempt to help to educate the public as to what this government is in fact doing, as opposed to what they say they are doing. These taxes, Mr. Speaker, make it extremely hard for middle-class Canadian families to make ends meet. This is a tax directly on the items that Canadians need to make their households run properly. A tax on bicycles, a tax on blankets, a tax on wigs, a tax on coffee makers, on paintbrushes, on kitchen knives, on iPods. Yes, Mr. Speaker, on iPods. The dreaded iPod tax is here, thanks to the Conservative government. And this is the best part, Mr. Speaker. The only way to avoid the iPod tax is to join the iPod registry. Does that sound like the gun registry? My goodness.
Oh, my goodness.
And some of these tax increases demonstrate a heartless disregard for Canadians. And I've mentioned the tax on wigs. Who do you think, Mr. Speaker, is the group that makes greatest use of wigs? It's actually Canadians undergoing chemotherapy. And I can't believe that this government would willingly attack Canadian cancer patients like this. What's really happening here is that we are seeing the end product of a hastily made policy done on the back of an envelope to meet an artificial deficit reduction deadline. In their 2011 platform, the government set an unrealistic deadline to eliminate the deficit, and now they're scrambling to make it happen, doing calculations on the backs of envelopes, raising taxes on middle-class families when they said that they wouldn't. And so the government should understand that the Canadian tariff regime is a complex machine with many moving parts, and to do something with the snap of the finger on the back of an envelope is obviously going to have unintended consequences, like the example on chemotherapy, which I just mentioned. I don't think the Conservatives deliberately set out to attack people on chemotherapy, but they didn't think things through, and so that was one of the unintended consequences of this very bad legislation. And I'll end with one last point, Mr. Speaker, and this is another, I'm not sure if it's intended or unintended consequence, but there are negative effects on least developed countries, on the poorest countries in the world, because when those countries import inputs from countries which are now seeing higher tariffs, like India and China, inputs into the manufacture, for example, of clothing, now that these tariffs are higher, Canada, when it's importing things from these least developed countries, will have to impose higher tariffs, which will impose a burden not only on Canadian consumers, but also on the residents of these least developed countries. So I would argue in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that from the point of view of government honesty, to deny that they're raising taxes is a travesty, and that indeed these measures have negative effects for Canadian consumers, for people living close to the border, and for some of the poorest countries in the world.
You're here.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his comments on the Conservatives' efforts to raise taxes that are really going to hurt the average Canadian family. We've heard about taxes on school supplies, taxes on bicycles, shoes, taxes on iPads, iPods, taxes on hospital parking. And I want to talk about that latter. We had a family member a few years ago who had a sudden illness, and they were in the hospital for about 6 weeks. Now, every family hopes to avoid something like that, but sometimes family members are in hospital for weeks, sometimes months. But I know we were at the hospital every single day. And boy, the parking adds up, and for an average family to be paying that every single day, it's an unexpected charge. It really can hit a family hard at a time when they're already down with a family illness. Can the honourable member comment on why the Conservative government would possibly hit Canadians while they're trying to deal with a family emergency like a major illness?
Member for Markham-Unionville.
Well, the short answer is because they're Conservative. The longer answer is, I said earlier, I didn't accuse them of deliberately going after people taking chemotherapy. I don't think Conservatives would do that, neither would any other party in this House. But in terms of imposing higher parking charges on people visiting loved ones in hospitals over an extended period of time, I think they knew what they were doing on that one. And I agree with the honourable member that it's not an appropriate action for people in such conditions, and that savings should be found in other ways that don't bear down in such an unfair and strong manner on select group of vulnerable Canadians.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Okanagan-Coquihalla.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's speech today. He's asked a variety of different questions, and I would like to ask him the question. First of all, the preferential tariffs. Mr. Speaker, preferential tariffs were given back in 1974, was the last time this program was reviewed, specifically to help aid developing countries. Again, I mentioned Brazil, Russia, India, China. Many of these are where we see most of the economic growth is. So first I'd ask if the member, again, when would the member support this particular policy being reviewed, if not now? Again, these tariffs have been around longer than I have been. And then second of all, from my understanding, the Liberal Party has stood traditionally for free trade. Mr. Speaker, if we don't have tariffs at some of these levels for some of these countries, there's no incentive for them to bargain and to come to the table and to enter into free trade agreements. And just lastly, Mr. Speaker, this government has reduced tariffs at over $590 million, Mr. Speaker, particularly around manufacturing equipment, because we want to see manufacturers producing right here in Canada. And I'd like to ask the member to please look at supporting those kinds of measures, because that is what's going to keep our economy growing.
For Markham-Unionville.
In this budget, the tariff increases are $330 million a year. The tariff decreases are $76 million a year. I would remind the honourable member that 333 is bigger than 76, so it's a net increase in tariff revenue this budget, which means a net increase in tax. And your government, his government, says it would not have any increases in tax, and that's my basic point. But in terms of your other point, an increase in the tariff on goods from China or India or Brazil is an increase in the tariff as much as an increase from any other country in the world, and is equally a tax increase and equally will disadvantage Canadian consumers. So if the government thinks that low tariffs on China are a bad thing, but they don't want to hit Canadian consumers, raise the tariff on China, but reduce the tariff on other countries so as to neutralize the negative effect on Canadian households. The way they've done it, they have deliberately created a strong negative effect on Canadian middle-class households, and that is a tax hike, and that is wrong.
Resuming debate. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you.